The first time I realized my son no longer saw me as his mother was not when he sold my jewelry without asking. It was not even when he stopped visiting the hospital after my stroke. No, it was the morning I overheard him say to his wife in a tone so cold it burned, "She's too senile to know how much money she has. We'll just put her in the cheapest place and say it was the only option." I stood in the hallway, back against the wallpaper we chose together when he was 6, when he still needed nightlights and bedtime stories. I had come out of my room to ask for tea. Instead, I got that sentence, sharp as broken glass, under bare feet. He didn't know I could still understand. The stroke took my speech for a while, but not my comprehension. That was their mistake. They thought I was gone inside just a husk, but I was still there, watching, listening, and bleeding quietly. I did not cry then. I simply turned and went back to my room, closed the door, and stared at the ceiling. The silence of betrayal is loud. It echoes in the bones. This was the boy I fed with my hands when he was too weak to chew. The boy I stayed awake with during chicken pox, lying next to his burning skin just so he wouldn't feel alone. This was the boy I taught to write thank you notes and hold the door open for others. He had become a man I didn't recognize, a man with cold plans. They moved me into the nursing home 3 days later. It smelled of antiseptic and boiled cabbage. The walls were beige, the kind of color chosen not to offend anyone, and yet it offended me deeply. It was the color of giving up. He didn't come inside, just helped carry the suitcase, kissed the air near my cheek, and drove away. His wife didn't even get out of the car. I sat on the bed for hours. The window overlooked a cracked parking lot. A single pine tree struggled to stand straight against the wind. They thought I had nothing left, but they were wrong. I had time. I had memory. I had dignity. And quietly I had a plan. There was a time not too long ago when I would have given my life for that boy. I remember the sound of his first cry in the delivery room, the sharp, desperate wail that filled the sterile air and filled my chest with purpose. I remember how his fingers wrapped around mine, how his tiny body melted into my arms like he belonged nowhere else. I didn't sleep for 3 nights after bringing him home. I just watched him breathe. I gave up a career in design to raise him. I had always dreamed of opening my own boutique fabrics, swirling around my fingertips, sketches taped across the walls. But dreams can wait, I told myself. Love comes first. I cooked every meal from scratch. I packed lunches with sweet notes hidden under the napkins. I drove to every piano lesson, every science fair, every scraped knee incident that needed my kiss more than a bandage. He was my world. I thought I was his. When his father left, I didn't let it harden me. I worked double shifts to keep the house, to pay for his school, to keep his life as untouched as possible. I went without new clothes for years, wore shoes until the soles gave up. But he never knew. I didn't want him to feel like he owed me anything. On his graduation day, I wore the old blazer I had saved from the days when I still dreamed. He hugged me and whispered, "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." I carried that sentence like a pearl for years. I remember the way he used to run to the car when I picked him up, the way he once said after a bad day, "You're my safe place." Somewhere along the way, I became an obligation, a burden, something to manage, not someone to love. I noticed it before the stroke. He stopped calling, just to talk. His wife would pick up and say, "We're busy right now," even when I could hear them laughing in the background. I started hearing about his life from others, promotions, vacations. He never mentioned them to me, but I kept telling myself, maybe he's overwhelmed. Maybe it's just a phase. Maybe he still cares. I clung to the maybes like a life raft. That's what mothers do, isn't it? Until the stroke, until the silence, until the betrayal, whispered through a hallway I paid for inside a home I gave them. There is a silence that follows betrayal. It isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It hums like fluorescent lights in a forgotten corridor, always there, always cold. That silence grew in the nursing home. At first I thought maybe the calls would come later. Maybe they needed time to settle back into their routines. I gave it a week, then 2. No one called. My meals arrived on a tray with lukewarm tea and questions I no longer bothered to answer. The nurses were kind, in the way people are kind when they know you don't have anyone left. One morning, I tried calling him. My hand shook as I dialed the number from memory. It rang, once, twice, then voicemail. He never called back. That was when I stopped hoping. I started noticing the little things. How the woman down the hall got visits every Thursday from her granddaughter. How the man in the wheelchair had fresh flowers on his table, always from the same woman with tearful eyes. No one came for me. The room was sterile, like a hospital room that had given up on pretending to be a home. My clothes hung in the tiny closet, all in soft colors, now, as if bright colors were only for the living. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself, but I did recognize something else. I had been trained my whole life to be silent, to be patient, to understand. But now, for the first time, I saw what that had cost me. There was a part of me buried under years of sacrifice and softness that began to stir. I started writing, tiny journal entries at first, just thoughts, fragments, words like forgotten, dismissed, used, then more. I wrote about the way he used to smile when he got off the school bus, about the night he forgot my birthday, about the ache in my chest when he told me he'd be too busy to come to the hospital. I wrote until the pen felt like it belonged to me again. And in that silence, a new voice grew, my own. It was a Tuesday. Quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you think the world forgot to wake up. I had just finished writing about my wedding day. The silk gloves, the rain, the way his father looked at me like I was the only future he could see. Then the letter came, an envelope, thick and formal, tucked under my breakfast tray. No return address. My name, full and neat, in handwriting that tugged at memory. Inside a letter from my old lawyer. It was dated 3 years ago. He had passed away, and the firm had gone through his archived files. Among them, a copy of my will and an unsigned letter I had asked him to hold on to. But there was more. There was a trust account, money I had forgotten I even had set aside from an insurance claim after my husband died. At the time, I had asked the lawyer to hold it until I turned 75. I had never reached out to access it, but I had just turned 75. The account was still active, untouched, nearly $1.2 million. I read the figure over and over, not because I wanted the money, but because of what it meant. They had called me senile. They had said I had nothing. They had thrown me away, thinking I was empty. But I was not empty. I had something they hadn't expected: options. For the first time in months, I felt my spine straighten. My breath deepened. I waited. I watched. And I planned. It didn't happen in a courtroom. It didn't need lawyers, or drama or public spectacle. It happened in a quiet room with no curtains, just me, my notebook, and the knowledge that I finally held the cards. I had asked the nursing home receptionist to dial my son's number from the front desk phone. I told her it was time sensitive that I needed to speak to him directly. She smiled politely and nodded. He picked up on the second ring. "Hello." His voice still had that crispness, that practiced tone of efficiency he used when speaking to people he thought beneath him. "It's me." My voice had returned in full by then, not strong but clear enough to carry the weight of everything unsaid. A pause. Then, "Mom, I want to see you," I said, "in person. No wife, no excuses." He hesitated. "Is something wrong?" "Yes," I said, "but not the way you think." He came that afternoon, alone. He stepped into the room like a stranger entering a museum, cautious, detached. His eyes moved over the furniture, the walls, everything but me. Then they landed on the manila folder on the table. I didn't offer him tea. I didn't ask how he'd been. I simply pushed the folder toward him. "What's this?" he asked. "Proof," I said, "of who I am, of what you forgot." He opened it. His eyes scanned the documents, the trust account details, the letter from the law firm, the copy of my will. His face turned a shade paler. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I sat as still as stone. "You had this all this time?" he asked quietly. "No," I corrected him. "I remembered it recently, after you decided I was disposable." He looked up, something behind his eyes, breaking, cracking. "It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think." I said, my voice calm, but blade sharp. "You put me here because it was convenient. You assumed I had nothing left. You assumed I wouldn't notice. I was trying to help by calling me senile, by dumping me here like yesterday's mail." He had no answer. I leaned forward. "I'm changing my will." His shoulders stiffened. "I'm leaving everything to a foundation for women like me, women who gave their lives for people who never said thank you, women who deserve dignity even when the world tries to strip it away." His hands curled into fists, but I could see it beneath the anger, the fear, the realization that he had not just lost money, he had lost something far more permanent. Me. He opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a hand. "You already buried me," I said. "Now you'll have to live with the ghost." He left without another word, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. Freedom is quiet. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or cheers. It slips in like morning light through sheer curtains, slow and golden. I woke up the next day and felt it resting on my chest like a warm hand, the absence of weight, of waiting, of wondering. I made tea for myself. Real tea. Not the lukewarm kind that came on a plastic tray, but the kind I used to brew on rainy days. The scent filled the room. Jasmine and something else. Memory, maybe. I opened the window. The pine tree still stood crooked, but something about it seemed beautiful now. Resilient. The nurse asked me if I wanted the television on. "No, thank you," I said. My voice was calm, clear. I spent the morning reading. In the afternoon, I wrote. I started writing letters to women I had met here, to women I hadn't met yet. I wrote about endurance and loss and the unbreakable core that remains even after the world tries to hollow you out. I sent the first draft of my foundation charter to a pro bono lawyer. He called me ma'am 3 times before I told him to stop. I wasn't interested in pity, just results. I called my granddaughter. She answered with joy in her voice I hadn't heard in years. She told me she missed my stories. I promised I'd write them down for her. And I did. I wrote my story, all of it, not the glossy version, the real one, the messy, beautiful, brutal truth. And then I packed a small suitcase. I checked out of the nursing home. The driver opened the car door and asked, "We may..." To see, it was open. The road was mine. Anywhere I want. I didn't move into a luxury condo. I didn't book a flight to Paris. I found a quiet cottage, 2 towns over the kind, with ivy crawling up the sides and wind chimes that sang in the afternoon breeze. It wasn't grand. It wasn't flashy. But it was mine. The deed was signed in my name alone. For the first time in decades, there was no for the family, no to help the kids, no justifications, just me. The woman who handed me the keys smiled and said, "Starting fresh." I nodded. Starting true. There were moments in the early days when I would still wake in a panic, dreams of wheelchairs and narrow hallways, trays with plastic lids, voices calling me by the wrong name. But then I'd hear the wind in the trees, feel the real ceramic mug in my hand, and remember, I'm free now. I planted lavender by the window, tomatoes out back. The soil felt foreign in my hands, at first, like I'd forgotten how to create something that wasn't meant for someone else. But the body remembers, the soul remembers. Neighbors came by with baked bread, curious but kind. No one asked why I was alone. No one questioned my choices. I liked that. Every Sunday, I drove myself to the library. I checked out books on philosophy, feminism, gardening. I let my curiosity roam unchained. I wasn't just recovering, I was becoming. I joined a writing circle. At first, I said nothing. I just listened. To young women full of fire, to widows full of silence, to teenagers whose pain echoed mine from decades ago. Then, one day, I read a piece aloud. It wasn't about betrayal. It wasn't about pain. It was about strength. The room went quiet when I finished, not the awkward kind, the sacred kind. A woman named Iris, 79 years old and sharp as glass, came to me afterward. She took my hands and said, "I've waited my whole life to hear someone say that out loud." We began meeting every Thursday. Then others joined. It became something, not a foundation on paper, but a living one, a sanctuary of women who had lost everything, but still carried themselves like queens in exile. And in their company, I wasn't a victim. I was a voice. We never called it a group. We never gave it a name. But every Thursday, the same women came back. Some brought notebooks. Some brought poems. Some brought nothing but silence. And somehow that was enough. We didn't meet to fix each other. We met to be heard. Iris talked about the child she gave up in 1962 and how she'd lived her whole life wondering if he ever looked for her. Maria, once a nurse, told stories of patients she'd loved more than her own family. Ruth, who hadn't spoken in months, cried for 10 minutes straight one afternoon, and when she finished, she said thank you. It became a rhythm, a kind of sacred ritual. We weren't saints. We weren't martyrs. We were just women who had survived too many winters without coats, too many nights without being asked how we were really doing. Some days we laughed until our sides ached. Other days we sat in silence and let the wind fill the spaces between us. No one judged. No one interrupted. One morning I brought in my old journals, not the new ones, not the ones I wrote after the stroke. The old ones, the ones I wrote when he was still small, when hope still bloomed like wildflowers in my chest. I read a page aloud. He asked me today if I would still love him if he turned into a frog. I said yes, of course. He smiled and told me that made me the best mom in the whole universe. I believed him. The room was still. Some smiled, some cried. I felt no shame, only reverence. That day something shifted. I realized my story no longer belonged to the past. It wasn't a collection of tragedies. It wasn't a long list of disappointments. It was a bridge from them to me, from me to the world. A young woman named Elsie, barely 25, always hiding behind her hoodie, raised her hand and said, "Would you ever publish those?" I almost laughed, but she looked so earnest, like it mattered. "I don't know," I said. "Would anyone read them?" "Yes," she said, "I would." I smiled, not the polite kind, the real kind, the one that starts behind the eyes and spreads through your ribs. Maybe it was time. I spent a week staring at that blank screen, wondering where to begin. It's one thing to tell a story in a room full of kind eyes and shared scars. It's another to write it for the world, a world that may skim scroll or worse mock. But then I remembered something Iris said. If we don't tell our stories, someone else will, and they'll get it wrong. So I wrote, not just my pain, but the quiet moments, the invisible sacrifices, the everyday heroism no one applauds. I wrote about laughter and laundry, about love and its slow erosion, about silence and how it can be louder than any scream. I didn't try to sound smart. I just told the truth. I submitted the manuscript to a small press a friend of Elsie's recommended. I expected nothing. But 3 weeks later, I got a call. They wanted to publish it. The editor said, "It doesn't read like a memoir. It reads like a prayer someone forgot to say out loud." I cried when I hung up, not because of the book, but because someone saw me, all of me. The women cheered when I told them. Maria brought sparkling cider. Iris wrote a poem called "The Day She Rose." We laughed until dusk. I had forgotten how joy could feel, like light pouring from your chest. Then came the launch. They hosted it at a community center downtown. Not fancy, but full of warmth. The room was packed. Young women, grandmothers, men who looked unsure of why they came, but stayed anyway. Some brought tissues, some brought mothers. I read the passage about the frog, about love that promises to stay through every transformation, about how sometimes we forget that mothers are allowed to transform too. When I finished, there was silence, then standing applause. But what mattered more were the hands that reached for mine afterward, the trembling thank yous, the "me too" whispers. It wasn't just my story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been forgotten and dared to come back louder. The book didn't hit bestseller lists. It didn't go viral, but it moved quietly, steadily through hands that needed it. Libraries requested more copies. Shelters asked for donations. A professor emailed me to say she added it to her syllabus. I didn't need fame. I needed resonance, and I got it. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a conference for caregivers and elder advocates. The theme was dignity in the shadows. When I arrived, I expected a small room, maybe a dozen attendees. There were over 200 people, nurses, social workers, survivors, daughters, sons, grandchildren. A man with tears in his eyes came up to me after my talk and said, "I didn't understand what my mother felt until today. I'm going to call her tonight." That one moment was worth everything. I went home exhausted and alive. My cottage smelled like warm thyme and old paper. I sank into the armchair by the window and realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living with purpose. The women's circle grew. We still met every Thursday, but now we had a name, The Quiet Return. Iris came up with it, because that's what we all deserve, she said, to come back, even if no one expected us to. We started collecting stories, not just ours, but letters from women across the country. We published an anthology, then another. People began sending donations, no matter how small, just to keep the stories alive. One afternoon, Elsie pulled me aside. Her voice was trembling. "I'm going back to school," she said, "for social work. Because of you." I held her. She was shaking. So was I. It was never just about dignity for me. It was about reclaiming the right to be seen as whole, as wise, as still in bloom. And maybe it was about legacy, not the kind carved on tombstones or typed in legal documents, the kind etched in hearts, folded into pages, passed from one brave hand to another, because in the end, that's all I ever wanted to matter, on my own terms. Winter came slowly that year, like an old friend hesitant to visit. The air turned sharper, and the trees outside my cottage let go of their leaves with quiet dignity, each one a soft surrender. I watched them fall with something that felt like understanding. I had changed, not in the dramatic way people expect transformation to look. There were no big declarations, just the small daily proof. I smiled more. I sang while making tea. I no longer flinched when I saw mothers with sons. The pain had softened. It hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled the room. One Sunday, I received a letter in a brown envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. My son's. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. "Mom, I don't know where to start. I saw your book. I read every word. I cried through most of it. I'm not writing to justify anything. I was cruel. I was selfish. I let my wife speak for both of us, and I never looked back. You deserve better. If you never want to speak to me again, I understand. But if there's any part of you that wants to see me, I'd like to come, alone, just me. Love, David." I didn't cry. I didn't jump to hope. I placed the letter by the window and let the wind rustle the edges. I didn't know yet what I would say. But I knew one thing: I wasn't the same woman he abandoned. If he came, he would meet someone reborn, someone who didn't need his apology to breathe freely, but might still offer him a seat at the table, if he asked with the right heart. That evening, at the quiet return, I read the letter aloud. There was silence. Then Ruth, soft-spoken, usually silent, cleared her throat. "Forgiveness isn't weakness," she said. "It's proof that you're strong enough to choose peace instead of punishment." I nodded. "I'll think about it," I said. And I meant it. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying my past. I was walking beside it. He arrived on a Tuesday. No phone call first, no warning. Just a knock on the wooden door. At noon, 3 soft raps that sent a tremble through the walls of my small cottage. I knew it was him. A mother always knows. I opened the door slowly. He stood there in a coat too thin for the season, older then. I remembered eyes lowered not from shame, but something heavier, regret. I stepped aside. He entered. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We sat at the small round table where I drank my morning tea, the lavender blooming outside, like it always did, quietly, insistently. "I wasn't sure you'd open the door," he said. "I almost didn't," I replied. He looked down. I deserved that. Silence settled between us, but this time it wasn't the kind that crushed. It was the kind that held room for truth. I read every word he said, even the ones that hurt. Those were the ones I had to write, I said. "I know." He took out a small envelope. "I started seeing a counselor. She told me I needed to stop pretending you were just coping. You weren't coping. You were surviving what I did. I nodded but said nothing. He slid the envelope across the table. This isn't money. It's a letter, one I wrote to you 3 years ago. I never sent it. I didn't think you'd care. I picked it up but didn't open it. He watched my hands. You always said forgiveness wasn't something owed. It was something earned. I remember, I said. Well, he whispered, I'm here, ready to earn whatever you're willing to give. He didn't ask for a hug. He didn't pretend we could go back. He just sat there finally fully vulnerably present, and that mattered more than anything he could have said. After a while, I got up and put the kettle on. Do you still take sugar? I asked. He looked up. Yes, 2 spoons. I smiled faintly. You've always taken 2. And we sat, not as mother and son, not yet. Just 2 people finally seeing each other as they truly were. And that was the beginning. The next few visits were cautious. He came every Sunday afternoon, always with something in hand, homemade banana bread, old photographs, once even a packet of seeds, because I remembered you love marigolds. I didn't forgive him outright. I didn't even say the word, but I let him show up. And sometimes that's how healing begins, not with declarations, but with repeated presence. One Sunday, he brought a photo album, not the ones I kept, his. It was frayed and out of order, full of hasty Scotch tape and blurry Polaroids. We sat on the floor, knees touching, flipping through time. This one, he said, holding up a photo of his 3rd birthday. I don't even remember it, but you look so tired. I nodded. I was working night shifts. He looked at me. Then, not like a son looking at his mother, but like a man finally seeing a woman who had lived 1,000 lives before his even began. I thought you were just always strong, he said quietly. I was, I replied, but strength doesn't mean painless. Later, as he washed the dishes without asking, I looked out at the garden. The marigolds had bloomed early this year, defiant little bursts of color against the fading grass. That night, I wrote in my journal, he's not trying to rewrite the past. He's trying to earn his place in the present, and maybe I'm letting him. At the quiet return, I shared this entry. Ruth clapped softly. Maria hugged me. Elsie, now in her 2nd year of social work, smiled and said, this is what redemption looks like. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt human. And maybe that's the most sacred thing of all, to be seen, to be flawed, to be loved anyway, quietly, gently, and on your own terms. In March, he brought his daughter, my granddaughter. I hadn't seen her since she was 8. She was nearly 17 now, taller than I expected, hair-dyed burgundy eyes, wide with both caution and wonder. This is Grandma, he said softly, as if the word might shatter in the air. She nodded. Hi. I said nothing at first, just took her in. She looked like him when he was young, before the hardness, before the ambition, before the forgetting. You like books, I asked. She glanced at the stack beside my reading chair. Kind of. I handed her one. This was my favorite at your age. I wrote my name in the back before I ever knew I'd have children. She flipped to the back and smiled at the faded ink. I liked the handwriting. Small steps, gentle gestures, a kind of beginning that didn't need fireworks, just openness. She started coming with him every other Sunday. Sometimes she asked about the book. Sometimes we just baked bread. Sometimes she sat in silence while I knitted her legs curled under her like a cat. One afternoon, she said, Dad told me about what happened. Between you two. I looked up from my tea. I think he's trying, she said, but he's not great at it. I laughed. He never was. She smiled. You're kind of badass. I blinked. Is that a compliment? It's the highest compliment. I smiled back. That evening after they left, I walked out to the garden. The air still held a hint of winter, but something was blooming beneath it. I realized I was no longer living in the past. I wasn't clinging to pain or waiting for an apology. I wasn't proving a point. I was just here, alive, rooted, growing again. Maybe forgiveness wasn't a gift I gave him. Maybe it was the way I finally let go of needing to be the one who hurt less. I sat by the marigold's eyes closed and let the wind tell me what it always knows. You don't have to go back to who you were to bloom again. You just have to stay open. Spring unfolded like a secret slow, then suddenly everywhere. The garden sang in green, the lavender returned fuller than before, and I woke each morning with something unfamiliar blooming in my chest. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being okay. The kind that comes from knowing you will be. One morning, I sat at the kitchen table, sunlight pooling on the wood, and began drafting a letter, not to David, not to anyone still alive, to myself. Dear me, you carried more than anyone saw. You gave even when empty. You stayed when it was easier to run. You loved like it was your only language. And when they forgot you, you remembered yourself. I'm proud of you. I forgive you for the silence, for the waiting for thinking. Dignity had to be earned. It didn't. It was always yours. I folded it and placed it in the front of my journal. That week, I read it aloud at the quiet return. No one spoke for a long time. Then Iris, with her silver-streaked braid and voice like gravel, warmed in sunlight, whispered, "That's the letter we've all been waiting to receive." We decided to write letters to ourselves that day, not as a writing exercise, as a reckoning. We sealed them in envelopes, tied them with twine, and placed them in a wooden box by the fireplace. Maybe we'll open them in a year, Maria said. Or maybe never, Ruth added. Maybe it's enough that they exist. Elsie, now interning at a women's shelter, said she wanted to bring this practice there. That's when I realized this wasn't just my healing anymore. It was a ripple, a thread, a new way of being. I wasn't just reclaiming my dignity. I was offering a mirror to every woman who thought hers had been lost. And one by one, they were finding it again, not with fists, but with softness, with space, with the quiet power of saying, I'm still here. That summer, I stopped locking my front door, not out of carelessness, out of trust, not in people, but in the life I had built with bare hands and battered truths. There was nothing left to steal, nothing that wasn't already rooted deep within me. David still visited, but less out of guilt now, and more out of rhythm, familiarity. Sometimes we didn't speak much. He trimmed the hedges while I read on the porch. His daughter planted zinnias beside the marigolds. I taught her to cut them without bruising the stems. Healing, I've learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's three people sharing silence under a lazy afternoon sky. One evening, the quiet return held its first public reading. The town's library lent us a room, fold-out chairs, a podium borrowed from the high school. We strung paper lanterns and served lemonade with too much sugar. I wore the same blue cardigan I had on the day I arrived at the nursing home. Symbolic, maybe. Intentional, absolutely. Elsie read first, a letter to her younger self. Then Maria, who told the story of the patient who had died holding her hand, whispering, "You remind me of my daughter." Iris recited a poem so raw the room forgot to breathe. Then it was my turn. I walked to the front pages, shaking ever so slightly. and looked at the faces in front of me. Some I loved, some I just met, all of them witnesses. I read the first entry I'd written after my stroke, the one I never thought anyone would hear. They think I'm not here, but I am. They think I'm broken, but I bend. I wait. I know who I am. I may not speak, but I see. And one day I will rise again. When I finished, no one clapped. They stood, one by one, quietly, in stillness. It wasn't about applause, it was about reverence, a shared knowing that we are never too far gone to return, that we are never too silent to be heard, that we are never, ever without worth. The weeks that followed the reading felt different, not brighter, not easier, just lighter, as if the act of speaking aloud, what once lived only in the corners of my soul, had made space for something new to grow. I found myself humming again while washing dishes. I caught myself smiling at strangers. The pain didn't disappear. It just didn't hold the pen anymore. Then came the letter from the nursing home. It was formal, stamped, unsigned. A copy of an internal report. It detailed budget changes, staff turnover, and a brief line that struck something deep. Concerns raised by Ms. Ard, my full name, former resident, led to a shift in protocol and improved resident advocacy measures. I read it twice. No thank you. No signature. But it didn't matter. They had changed something because I had spoken, quietly, firmly, without a tantrum, without a war, just presence, persistence. I folded the letter and tucked it inside my journal beside my first post-stroke entry. That night, I sat beneath the stars. No noise, no ceremony, just me and the sound of my breath against the sky. I thought about all the versions of myself I had been, the young mother who gave everything, the silenced patient in the beige room, the woman with trembling hands who picked up a pen and wrote herself home. I whispered a thank you to them all, and then I made a list, not of regrets, but of things I still wanted to do. Visit the sea again, learn to make French bread, write a letter to every woman in the quiet return dance, barefoot in the rain, forgive myself more often, live with softness, even when the world is hard. It wasn't a bucket list. It was a declaration that my life wasn't winding down. It was still unfolding. And I finally, unapologetically, was the one holding the thread. I visited the sea in late September. It was quieter than I remembered, less about crashing waves, more about long exhalations. The tide pulled in like a soft breath, retreating just as gently. I stood at the edge, with my shoes off toes, curling into the wet sand, the wind lifting the ends of my scarf. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. A younger couple walked by, holding hands, whispering secrets. They smiled at me, the kind of smile reserved for strangers who seem unbothered by time. I nodded back, palms open to the wind. That evening, I wrote my last journal entry in the old notebook. Its pages were frayed, now corners, curled from years of grief and growth. The sea did not ask if I was worthy of return. It simply welcomed me, wave after wave. I think that's what life is meant to do. Not forgive everything, not forget, but to make room again and again. I mailed out letters to every member of the Quiet Return. No instructions, just love. Baggergaidan, just fragments of our shared truth wrapped in gratitude. A week later, Maria wrote back. "You didn't save me," she said. "You reminded me I was never lost." Elsie visited on a rainy Thursday. She brought wine and questions about aging. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Of dying," I replied. "No, of being forgotten." I sipped slowly. "Not anymore. You're not afraid of being alone." I looked at the marigolds outside, still blooming stubbornly in the chill. There's a difference between being alone and being unloved, I said. I may live alone, but I am not unloved. She leaned against my shoulder. You're the bravest person I know. No, I whispered. I just stopped apologizing for surviving. That night, the rain softened into mist. The garden shimmered like it was lit from within, and I too shimmered, not because of what I'd been through, but because of who I had chosen to become after. Time, I've learned, isn't a straight line. It loops, revisits, echoes. Some mornings I wake with the weight of old memories pressing against my chest, but I no longer fear them. They're part of me, not chains, just shadows that remind me there is light. David now calls every Thursday, not to check in, just to talk. Sometimes we say nothing important. Sometimes we say everything. One day, he said, I read your list. What list? I asked. The one you wrote in your journal. The things you still wanted to do. I smiled. Ah, my declarations. I added one, he said, to walk beside you, not ahead of you, for however long you'll have me. We didn't speak for a moment. Then I said, that one's already done. I didn't expect peace to feel like this, so ordinary, so quiet, like the way sunlight falls on a wooden table, or how fresh bread smells when broken in half. The women's circle continued, but it changed. Ruth passed away. In her sleep, a note on her nightstand that read, "Thank you for making me feel real again." Iris began mentoring girls at the local school. Maria finally wrote the book she had carried in her for 40 years. And me, I planted a new garden bed. Not because I needed more flowers, but because the earth felt like home under my fingernails. One afternoon, I looked at the sky and thought, if this is it, I'm full. Not because my life was easy, but because it was honest. Because I didn't let their silence write the end of my story. Because I stood back up not once, but again and again. And because, above all, I chose something they never expected me to keep, my dignity. I closed my journal that night and whispered into the dark, I am not what they did to me. I am what I did with it. I woke up on my birthday to birdsong and sunlight pouring in like an unspoken blessing. 78. The number didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a badge, a marker of all the fires I had walked through and the softness I still carried anyway. There was no party, no candles, just a quiet breakfast with lavender honey, a fresh cup of tea, and a postcard from Elsie that read, "Thank you for teaching me that survival is sacred." I walked through the garden alone, fingers brushing each petal like a prayer. Marigolds, zinnias, rosemary thyme, all the things that grew in spite of everything. I whispered their names like family. Then I sat at the bench beneath the old pine, the same one I used to watch from a nursing home window, and I began to write. Not a letter, not a journal, a beginning, a novel. Fiction, but not really. A woman who is cast aside. A woman who finds herself not in rage, but in stillness. A woman who chooses not to vanish quietly, just like me. Because stories don't end with rescue, or romance, or revenge. They end with choice, and I chose dignity. I chose softness. I chose to be known by myself first, and somehow, in choosing all of that, I chose life again. Not the life they imagined for me, the one I reclaimed, the one I rewrote, the one that whispered every single day, you are not done, you are never too late, and you are, and always were, enough. The wind passed gently through the garden, rustling the leaves like applause. I didn't need witnesses, just breath, just earth, just the quiet triumph of a woman who never disappeared, only waited, and returned on her own terms, always,